Welcome to NERI's Wednesday monthly seminar. This week we are presenting in-house. My colleague Paul Goldrick-Kelly has been working on Ireland's electricity prices over time, and it's obviously a very interesting topic at the moment with the issues in the Middle East and prices going up and down, and possibly disruption to fossil fuels, and what that might mean for consumers and households and firms and business going forward. So this is part of work that is linked to Paul's PhD, and he's done some work for the Energy Services Union as well. Paul, sorry, I'll just introduce Paul a little bit better. Paul Goldrick-Kelly is an economist here in the NERI. Graduated from UCD with a HDip and MA in economics science, and he's produced research for the Nevin Economic Research Institute in healthcare, housing, tax and revenue sufficiency, productivity, and now onto issues around climate and electricity generation, power generation. Current interests are ecological sustainability and political economy, and incorporating issues related to the just transition. His PhD is on the topic of carbon lock-in and its manifestation and propagation through institutions. And as far as I remember, it's a country comparison with some other small open economies and see how we're doing. And I think the answer is we're not doing great relatively, but I'll leave that to Paul. So I'm gonna we usually wrap up the entire session after the hour and a half, or sometimes if the questions are good and the chat is good, we'll give it an extra 10 or 15 minutes. So I'll leave it to Paul to take his time. Let's 40 minutes max kind of thing, Paul, is it?
Sure.
And we'll see how we go then with time from there. Okay, and I'll shut myself off there. Thanks, Paul.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Ciarán, and thanks everyone for joining us on this. I think when we scheduled it, we didn't anticipate global events would kind of make this so problematically interesting, shall we say. But in any case, this is reflecting a report that I put out just earlier this year, looking at the question of Ireland's electricity prices over time. A key element of that really was this question of to what degree was our kind of relative position in the past a lot different to now. As many of you know, and it's been the subject of many articles and headlines and a lot of political debate, our Irish prices are pretty high in European context, which are pretty high globally. But that the perception, at least, it was that this might not have always been the case. So this report looked to investigate that. So this was done in collaboration with the Energy Services Union, the ESU, who are partners in this. And it's part of an ongoing project of work looking at the Irish electricity market. So this is just an initial piece. So to begin, I'll just offer you something of an outline, just signpost thing, because I've plenty of slides regarding charts. Now, you needn't be concerned about that. You don't need to pay attention to all the numbers. I'll sort of point out some of the key takeaways, and maybe if we have questions, we can return to them. But just to sort of signpost you here, first, there's that piece on price changes over time. Now, I phrase it that way because this is looking at what happened to prices relative to their starting point. Now, in this case, it's going to be in 1996, given the way European statistics are designed. What happened to prices? So how did prices change? That is kind of looking at inflation. The second part then goes to look at price levels. So we get a more accurate sense of the cost there and whether that's consistent with what we find in the first piece. And then moving on from there, having looked at domestic consumers, non-domestic consumers, I look at some breakdowns and some kind of overall high-level facts and entertain some possible explanations for these divergences. Though I should say that this isn't, the kind of a closed book on that case. I think there's a lot of complexity to look under the hood there, and I conclude just based on what I've found. So for starters, this price changes over time section looks at two pieces. The first of which is looking at the question of how does this price trend compare to aggregate price changes? So this is the question of, okay, if electricity prices increased by a large degree, does that just reflect price increases throughout the economy? Is it a fairly typical product in that sense? And secondly, do these electricity price movements over time look like those in other comparable EU states? So sort of divvying the two questions, does electricity price inflation look like general inflation? And regardless of that question, if it doesn't, do electricity price movements in Ireland resemble those in other EU countries? And as mentioned, this is done for consumer prices using the HCIP from 1996 onwards. That gives you a standardized measure of inflation across the Eurozone. So this first chart here is just showing you the decomposed trend for electricity prices as well as the broader price trend. So that the dotted lines you see kind of hovering along the bottom there, those are broader price inflation. So that's the general kind of level of inflation in the economy. Whereas the solid lines are electricity inflation. And green represents Ireland, not surprisingly, the darker blue represents the Eurozone. And sort of as you can see there, when we set 1996 equal to 100, there isn't much change really until the early 2000s, at which point Irish prices started to take off. Now, in both cases, we see that electricity price inflation has outstripped wider price inflation. But whereas the broader measure of inflation at HICP looks pretty similar in the Irish case, notwithstanding the fact that during the 2000s we seem to have an elevated inflation rate, but we kind of converged on typical Eurozone values as we recovered, as the kind of recovery from the financial crisis picked up pace late in the last decade. But Irish electricity prices diverge heavily from that broader inflation series, and they diverge from what occurred in the Eurozone. So in both cases, just to kind of summarize that, notwithstanding that 2000 period of excess cumulative inflation, which might be important in the context of looking at electricity price rises during that early kind of 2000s period, the cumulative rate of inflation in Ireland is comparable to that of the Eurozone. It's actually a little bit lower. So between 1996 and September 2025, when the series ends, at least for the purpose of this analysis, prices in the EU had risen by about a cumulative 82.4%, whereas that's 79.9% in Ireland, very similar. In both cases, as mentioned, electricity price inflation significantly outstrips that broader measure of inflation. However, you see a significant difference now between electricity price growth in Ireland versus the Eurozone as a whole. So while in the Eurozone, prices were at 2.5 times in September 2025 what they were in January 1996, over the same span, Irish prices quadrupled. And so as a second piece, just within this section of the report, I also then compare us to a number of other EU 15 states. Now, that EU 15 refers to the members of the EU prior to its expansion in 2004. And I choose those because they're at relatively comparable levels of development to ourselves. And of course, the Eurozone aggregate could mean that a single large country, for example, can drag down Eurozone averages. But looking at that, so divvying it into two spans, the first span prior to the recent price shock is what we're looking at here. Again, set in a similar way, you can see the green Irish line. We look pretty typical really until the early 2000s, at which point you see a series of step increases that bring us out into the kind of cumulative lead in terms of electricity price growth inflation. Now, we do drop off a little bit following the financial crash. We see a period of deflation, but we quickly resume that upward trend from about the end of 2012. And then, as you can see, in the mid 2000s, there's a bit of distance between ourselves and everyone else. Although, interestingly, from the maybe 2017, 2018 onwards, we look very similar to the red line there. That's the UK. So we appear to be pretty tightly coupled. Now, moving to the last few years, at least up until September 2025, we can see both in the UK and Irish case, similar trends. We have slightly later spikes in terms of that cost shock than other countries. And now, while we didn't see the highest spike of any state, I think that particular peak that you see there, I think, is Italy, if I recall correctly. You do see that we're still kind of up in the lead there. And quite notably as well, in both cases, we've been quite slow to fall back from that peak relative to other states. So again, just to summarize what you've just seen, you can kind of break this down into key periods of relative cost growth for Ireland. We diverge in the early 2000s, that's late 2001, early 2002, in a series of incremental price step increases. And by the financial crisis, cumulative cost growth in Ireland outstripped everybody else in the EU 15. We do decline somewhat at the height of the crisis, but from there, cost growth continues and we outstrip other EU 15 states. And we look very similar to the UK from around early 2017. And both systems show a price jump in 2022 that's delayed slightly compared to other states, with significantly slower fall in prices from those peaks by the end of the series. So what does this demonstrate? The Irish electricity price series is idiosyncratic, and many cost drivers appear before the recent, and I say current as I rephrase this, crisis period. Of course, we don't know really where that is going. So to move on, that initial analysis, as is often the kind of issue, as many people have pointed out when it comes to speaking about the cost of living crisis versus inflation. Inflation refers to a change metric, whereas many people are concerned with the aggregate level. So while price increases are a relevant data point, unit costs, like the cost level, is a better offers one a better sense of the costs you experience. And in this case, I show them for both nominal, so that's in normal euros, and PPS terms, so that's purchasing power standards. That's adjusting for the relative price or costliness of a country. So Ireland is relatively expensive. That deflates prices down to reflect costs adjusted for the fact that Ireland is expensive. And I include both because that adjustment for national price levels, at least in some senses, can tell you whether that excess cost in the Irish case simply reflects Ireland's overall expensiveness, or potentially on the domestic side, if you think that things like incomes might be linked to those price levels, maybe it's more of a measure of how kind of expensive it is in real terms for households. But the euro prices are also significant, particularly when it comes to the business sector, because that can be significant for areas like competitiveness. That price adjusted factor doesn't really matter for a firm that is exporting versus other firms, for example. It's really that sort of nominal unit cost that is relevant here, and electricity and energy being a key input into costs that make this important. And I also break the data down to show electricity prices before and after taxes and levies are applied. And I'll return to this point when we consider cost drivers going into the next section. So firstly, when we're looking at domestic consumers, historically, given the fact that the data are pretty incomplete for a range of consumption bands, so a lot of this analysis is based on not an aggregate measure of average cost, but costs depending on how much electricity you consume, which places you in different bands. So when it comes to the deep historical series, the most complete one is that between 1980 and 2007, and that's for the 3,500 kilowatt hour consumption group, which is relatively typical of a household consumer, at least over that span. And these data can reveal if and how these prices diverge from European comparators. And then from 2007, there's been a few redefinitions in the bands, etc. But we can examine data from 2007 across different consumption bands, which, as I mentioned, amount to you consuming more or less electricity per year, sort of banded together. So again, as mentioned, there are a lot of numbers here on screen, so I won't direct your attention to them all. And a key thing just to note before you sort of extrapolate forward and the series looks quite erratic is that each one of these sort of price adjustments is unique to each particular year. So 1980 is really comparable to 1990, at least in sort of direct numbers. But what's important is the relative numbers here. And what you can see is where numbers are highlighted in red, those are countries where prices were lower than in the Irish case. Now, we do have plenty of gaps as we go further back into the past, but we can see, look, as you see in 1980, 1990, there's maybe one country with prices below ours in the EU15. Now, from 2000, that starts to change. By 2007, particularly when we consider prices before taxes, Ireland becomes, like, really climbs up in terms of relative unit costs there. And as we move into that more detailed post-2007 series, you see this for a range of consumption bands, that orange band being the lowest consumption band, going up to the highest one, which is a blue line with purple markers. And this is showing you euro area prices before taxes and levies are applied and by those bands between July, and they do it in half-year cycles. So this is the latter half of 2007 compared to early 2025. And you can see across much of the series, with the exception later on of the lowest kind of consumption group, that's the sub 1,000 kilowatt hours group, Ireland is above the euro area average. And I should say that that line means that you're identical to the euro area average, which gives you a ratio of 1. If you're at 1.8, say, that means you're 1.8 times euro area prices at that point. And you can see that that trend has also gone up significantly from the first half of 2022. Now, if you add taxes and levies, you actually see that really very much moderates the situation, which is an important thing to note and understand in the Irish case. So pre-tax prices are pretty universally high, but the Irish state does not levy much in terms of taxes and levies. And in many cases, actually, given the way that they aggregate these figures, levies can be negative, as was the case when we got things like energy credits, which can actually bring total prices lower than pre-tax prices, if you follow there. And you can see in most cases that moderates us to in and around the EU average, at least in PPS terms. So that's adjusting for the fact that Ireland is expensive. We look fairly typical. Now, this is just kind of looking at the last available data point. That's the early part of 2025, just showing you some ranks and the share of the market, etc. You can see, again, just to emphasize that point, excluding taxes and levies, in many bands, we're at or near the top rank, which means most expensive in this case. Whereas when you do the PPS adjustment, or you add in those taxes and levies, which, as mentioned, in early 2025 were actually negative, as you can see there, really excluding taxes and levies, if you read across between excluding taxes and total, you see that total is lower. That really moderates our ranking. So what to sort of conclude from that? So that available data suggests that prices were comparatively low in Ireland from the 1980s, notwithstanding those gaps. And you saw relative price increases occurring in the 2000s. Again, that's consistent with that inflationary story that we saw in the first section. And that's particularly important for prices pre-taxes and levies, with Irish PPS prices climbing to 6th highest in the EU by 2007. So they go from amongst the lowest to 6th highest in the EU by 2007, in many cases continue to increase. However, this is moderated by low rates of levies and taxes. And when you look at the 2007 to 2025 series, most bands show high prices relative to euro area averages, again, before tax and levies. moderated, particularly post 2022, and that's where we see these relatively generous in the European context grants, at least it appears so in the data, by lower and often negative taxes and levies. And again, yeah, for 2025, high ranks are moderated by adjustment for the Irish cost level and these low taxes and levies. If we turn to non-domestic consumers, now I refer to that because it's specific nomenclature and they switch between industrial and non-domestic here. But as I understand it, they can be understood as the same. So for the first part, when we look at the historic series, we look at a fairly typical firm, 2 gigawatt hours of annual electricity consumption between 1980 and 2003. Again, we kind of break down the series and offer more data from 2007. Now, a thing here is I do offer some reporting in PPS in euro terms, but I do a lot of that excluding VAT and recoverable levies and for total prices. And now the reason I would do that is just because many businesses in many sectors can actually claim back VAT, making this a relevant cost category. So again, as we did before, the key thing to look out here is what's in red. Those indicate countries that are cheaper than ourselves. You can see in 1990, Ireland's relatively cheap, but particularly in 2003, you see it starting to diverge, becoming more expensive than the rest of the pack, particularly in that excluding VAT category. And again, so this is in nominal terms, excluding VAT. You can actually see that from 2007, we do see that drop reflecting the financial crisis, and we converge or drop below Eurozone averages. But particularly from the middle or latter half of the last decade, Irish prices tend to be significantly above Eurozone averages, at least in euro terms, except for that pink line. You can see it just at the very end, which represents the lowest category, less than 20 megawatt hours of consumption. And again, this is just offering, everything shifts down slightly when you do a PPS adjustment, but you can see that the problem remains there. So again, showing you that kind of ranking chart, excluding VAT and recoverable taxes, we're consistently among the most expensive jurisdictions in the EU 27. So to kind of wrap that up, price levels faced by non-domestic consumers, they begin to rise relative to other EU states in the early 2000s. You do see some fallback to euro area norms, but prices diverge from the mid-2010s, and they tend to show a bit of an upward trajectory, notwithstanding, a bit of jumping around. Somewhat moderated by price adjustment, but as I kind of noted as I introduced this piece, that price adjustment is less relevant, for something like an exporting firm, which set your kind of relative cost advantages. So kind of moving on from that analysis, how can we explain high prices? So this piece, at least firstly, I look at when I mentioned pre-tax and levy prices, you can decompose that further into energy and supply network costs. The first category, energy and supply, that includes things like your generation costs, markups, and hedging costs. Whereas network costs refer really to the costs of the maintenance of the grid in the system, including long distance transmission, as well as distribution of electricity to customers. I also explore the issue of the fuel mix, which is probably on everybody's minds, at least currently, and go through a little bit of its implications for prices. And finally, I offer some other potential contributors to these price movements we've seen in Ireland. So firstly, if you break down, so the blue bars that you see there, that's energy and supply, and the orange are network costs. So you can see across that series, if this was at a different scale, you should see that, yes, fairly typically, Ireland is a little bit above the euro area when it comes to network costs. Those are the orange bars. But you can see, particularly from the last few years within the series, the real action here in terms of the divergence is energy and supply costs. And you can see that's particularly dramatic in 2023. Even as euro areas prices themselves spike, our prices spike significantly more. And when you look at the same kind of analysis when it comes to business costs or non-domestic electricity costs, you see a similar story. Yes, there's some divergence between network costs in Ireland and the euro area, although I should actually mention in both cases towards the end of the series, you actually see us dropping below, and that would seem to be due to choices made by the regulator to kind of keep costs down, probably in response to this energy and supply spike, which, as you can see, is really where all the action is. Again, just to kind of put some numbers on that and summarize it a little bit, in most cases, we observe some elevation in network costs relative to Eurozone averages. Now, this is something I pick out because it's often cited, you know, the dispersion of the population, et cetera, results in higher grid costs, which might explain are kind of relatively expensive prices, you know, one-off developments, etc. And this does offer some, you know, support for that. But the thing is, it's a difference of scale here. So domestic consumers, in that case, you're a bit above the average in 2019 and 2022, though we fall below typical Eurozone values in 23 and 24, though you might expect that to pop back up. On the non-domestic side, it varies fairly substantially, although they fall again below profile in 2024. But as mentioned, the real action piece here is the energy and supply component. Minimum of 10.8% above in 2021, up to 77.5% above Eurozone average prices in domestic PPS terms in 2023. And in non-domestic Euro terms, it's never below a third over a comparator values. That minimum is in 2022, and it's up to 62.5% higher in 2024. And we don't have, or at least at the time of analysis, didn't have 2025 data yet. So that, again, sort of the through line of the logic of this piece here. And since we're pointing at energy and supply costs, I then went to look at some component pieces of that within it. And at least a major part that's at least tangible, because unfortunately, Eurostat doesn't offer, at least to the best of my knowledge, and if anybody watching knows further disaggregation, I would love to do that analysis in subsequent work. But at least from what I could see, the energy and supply component doesn't really offer you much of a breakdown in terms of the pieces that go into that. Whereas generation is pretty tangible. So I look at that, and at the very least, it's a major part of the story there. And these costs can vary according to both the composition of generation, so generation source, and market design. So those two interacting pieces are what's very important for price setting in many cases. And the obvious point to make here, as again, we're finding to our cost here, is that fossil fuel generation is sensitive to international prices for things like oil or natural gas. And alongside the weight of generation, this can be compounded by systems like merit order pricing, which I'll go through briefly in just a moment. And in both Ireland and the EU as a whole, which is what I make a comparison with here, generation has changed significantly over time. So we have a dynamic story here. Again, we have a lot of colors, and I'm not sure. I've tried to kind of make the grid here a little bit more apparent, but you can see significant differences between ourselves and the EU, and with ourselves over time, we should say. So early in the series, you see solid fossil fuels, peat products, so coal and peat is a much bigger component of Irish electricity than it is now. That has declined, you know, and that's reflected in emissions declines and everything else, and that's quite positive. But you can see in Ireland, natural gas is quite prominent, and it was up to, I think the stat is something like nearly 2/3 of generation in 2010 was from natural gas, but it's still close to half of generation in the Irish case, even as renewables and biofuels have expanded. And you can see some other differences, such as the presence of nuclear energy on the continent. And just to sort of wind through that point and kind of where it's going in terms of market design. So natural gas, as I mentioned there, plays a much larger role in Irish generation than is typical. And that's particularly notable given that we've adopted what's a standard kind of European energy market design. So at least in wholesale markets, producers, that would be generators here, meet buyers who are actually electricity suppliers, who subsequently sell to consumers in a series of markets across differing timeframes. And so what I mentioned here is the day-ahead market, but I should highlight that there are other markets, forward markets, longer-term markets, etc. But the day-ahead market, and I think I'm correct here in saying that it's the largest kind of these by volume, and so that's the one that I point to particularly here because it's quite instructive to link to prices. So within this market, just to explain its design a little bit, you meet in a central marketplace. They accumulate and aggregate generator bids. They obviously make bids based on their particular prices, expected markup, etc. And they rank them from cheapest to most expensive. And this is what gives you that merit order curve. Now, the point at which demand meets that curve sets the price. And that's known as the clearing price. And that's effectively the last unit of generation required to meet demand. But the important thing to note here, for those who aren't familiar with that, is that all generators receive that clearing price regardless of their bid. Okay, so even if you were further down the merit order, able to produce or putting through a bid for production at a much lower price, you will receive the clearing price set by a more expensive generator. That's relevant here because obviously given the role of natural gas, its preeminence in the Irish system, it would make one expect that in many cases, the last unit of electricity that will set the price in these kind of ongoing markets will be natural gas generation. And that does indeed appear to be the case. So this only runs up until, I think it's January 2025. I'm not sure if maybe there's an error in the scale. Actually, it might be the end of 25, if I remember correctly. Yeah, because I think I updated the series earlier this year. But you can see orange being the natural gas price, the day-ahead market price is in blue, and you can see those are very closely correlated. So that strike price, at least its average, is very closely related to natural gas price movements, sort of supporting that thesis that in many cases, natural gas is the price setter within the Irish electricity market. Now, to entertain some other factors that might be behind our divergences in price, we've already mentioned those factors, the reliance of natural gas, and crucially, I should say, it's not simply the presence of natural gas in the system, but its interaction with those kind of pricing mechanisms and things like relatively high network costs, which are often cited in the Irish case, which we found some evidence for, although they seem not to be the major kind of part of the story. But other factors that are often cited that I would think are fairly plausible include the nature of our small and relatively isolated electricity system. Now, it's often argued that this cuts against the economies of scale here. So that's basically, particularly on the generation side, given the fact that we're a relatively small and closed market, we don't have a great degree of interconnections with other markets. That leaves us sort of as a single entity. We're relatively isolated in the European context. And that means that generators have to, the size of plant is very much influenced by the relatively small size of our market. Larger plants, you would expect, imply lower fixed cost recovery because if they can generate more electricity, it takes them less electricity, less units sold really to recover those fixed costs, implying higher prices. You've, as I mentioned there, the relative absence of interconnection with other generation markets. That can actually explicitly relate to, if within that mechanism I described, Irish sources are primarily dictating price in those kind of clearing prices. If we had greater interconnection to other generation markets, particularly if they generated electricity at lower cost, that could potentially affect the merit order and thus reducing prices. Although there could be, I think that's worth analysis, maybe looking in and investigating the implications of reliance really on those interconnectors, but it's a factor nonetheless. And particularly, and I think this is an issue that warrants a lot of work and concern, and I'll come back to this, particularly when it comes to the conclusion in a few slides, but issues of curtailment, particularly for renewables. As you could see in that generation slide, renewables have expanded as a proportion of Irish generation, which is obviously a very positive story. but there are many constraint factors on our grid, which actually mean that we can't, at many times, use all of the generation provided by renewables at any time. Given as I mentioned, these kind of constraints, engineering challenges, etc. And so that those sites are effectively unused. So that, and particularly when it comes to that kind of merit order process that I described, renewable energy is what you expect to really sit at the bottom of those curves, because obviously they're beyond the fixed cost of constructing something like a wind farm. The marginal cost of your fuel is effectively zero. It's the wind blowing. So in many cases, particularly as these assets kind of mature, you'd expect them to offer electricity at very cheap prices. So less electricity at cheap prices, more role for more expensive sources on the merit order curve, resulting in higher prices. And it should be noted here as well, when you look at the series of demand growth from the early 1990s, both due to population and essentially the Celtic Tiger, you see from the 1990s electricity demand explodes. Now it explodes in the sense that it goes to meet what is typical for European countries, whereas Irish electricity consumption was quite low beforehand. But that increased growth, you'd expect, an imbalance of supply and demand might increase prices or, exacerbate those constraints that I already mentioned in terms of the historic grid. Now, to conclude here, it might be a little bit ahead of time, but maybe a little more time for questions at the end as a result. So we do find, at least I did find in this piece, that Ireland did experience atypical cost inflation, and that's corroborated by an analysis of unit prices. So prices were comparatively low, and their relative ranking, the relative cost of electricity in Ireland increased compared to a range of other comparable European countries. Factors that influence this, at least over the last few years, are things like our generation mix, its interaction with market design and price setting, and a variety of other constraints, as I alluded to there briefly. In the short to medium term, I would suggest that we begin to address these factors by looking at things like upgrading the grid. And one thing I mentioned in the report, that's kind of building off estimates from IFAC, is that things like the surplus in corporate tax receipts, our windfall receipts, this would be really an ideal site of investment, given the fact that if we don't know whether these receipts could kind of move in or move away from us, this is exactly the sort of kind of one-off investment in the productive capacity of our economy that would be really ideal. And I think IFAC, if I recall correctly, was something like a €7 billion investment they propose. Upgrade the grid, reduce some of those engineering challenges around curtailment, potentially bolster our connection to other markets, build those interconnectors, etc. And maybe in the medium to longer term as well, and perhaps now we haven't seen what will come of the kind of current situation in the Middle East, a consideration of market redesign, given the fact that, again, within the span of a few years, the nature of our markets and our reliance on natural gas is becoming an issue, and really resulting in significant price bumps. But one thing, even just to signal further work that I'm exploring here, is that these cost issues run further back in time. So these issues around natural gas, spikes, international events, etc., very relevant, obviously, in the here and now, but it doesn't really explain, or at least doesn't fully explain, really, that significant divergence, really, in that 2000s period. Now, that was also kind of associated with significant institutional change and liberalization in Irish electricity markets. So I think that's worth exploring in further detail to sort of unpack those elements. So that's me. So I'm happy to answer any questions following from that, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Paul.